Alright, this is the video in which I talk about some points to ponder from Chapter 4. For this chapter there are 3 major points that I'm going to review, and I'm going to get started right away. So our first point focuses on section 4.3c, which is titled Classification and Interpretation. This is on page 92. And here your authors talk about some different interpretations of business responsibility. And one of the things I'm sure you noticed is there's some nice parallelism with the previous chapter that talked about sustainability. You'll see the same thing again in the chapter that focuses on ethics. So we have these different interpretations of business responsibility, and once again we're running through some couplets, some pairs. For example, whether we should think in terms of being explicit or implicit. Explicit being individualized by the stakeholder versus implicit. Now, this is just the way that it's always done. Convergent, which is basically following what everybody else is doing, versus divergent, which is trying to blaze new stakeholder management trails. Now, I can tell you that by and large, organizations will tend to copy each other. In fact, there's a really neat theory called institutional theory that addresses this very specifically. And in institutional theory, they talk about things like mimetic isomorphism, and that's spelled M-I-M-E-T-I-C, mimetic, which basically means copying, and then isomorphism, which is copying structures for all intents and purposes. Organizations tend to follow each other. And the reason they do that, the primary reason they do that, at least according to institutional theory, is to achieve legitimacy in the eyes of stakeholders. So more often than not, you will see organizations following each other. The third couplet talks about immediate versus future responsibilities. You shouldn't be surprised to discover a bias for thinking about later generations of stakeholders, at least them and maybe the current, but just not staying focused only on the current. Social versus non-social stakeholders. So we've got people, right? Those are the social. We're talking about customers there, folks in our communities, folks in government. But the non-social stakeholders also include, are we talking about animals? Are we talking about the natural environment? And even future generations, the folks who don't exist yet. Do we need to think about all of that? I think most people would say yes. Then responsibility and accountability. So we're talking about whether we should be okay with organizations just doing whatever they might choose to voluntarily do in terms of responsibility, or do we also want some strong mechanisms that stakeholders can use to hold these organizations accountable? I think Sarbanes-Oxley is a good example of a regulation put into place because as much as we would like to think that financial institutions might choose to voluntarily do some things that would serve their stakeholders, for many reasons, that's not always, they don't always live up to maybe what you or I might hope for in terms of our expectations as investors. And so we end up with regulation like Sarbanes-Oxley to try and encourage, insist upon, compel these organizations to keep the needs of different stakeholder groups at the forefront of their decision making. And the last is the soft versus hard versus radical. This follows up on a discussion question. Do we want organizations to simply act within the rules of the game? Do we want them to do some things that ultimately will lead to fundamental shifts in the rules of the economic system, or overthrow the whole thing and create a whole new economic system? Certainly, I think we can appreciate the challenge associated with doing the most radical of choices. But soft, these incremental steps in the right direction, maybe that's all that a given organization can afford without sending itself into an economic death spiral. This is entirely possible. But certainly I think most of us would expect organizations to do everything they can to maximize their ability to be responsible. All right, so that's point 1. Take a sip of lemonade here. It gives you a chance to take a breather as well. Point 2, I'm looking at 4.4a with stakeholder value optimization. This starts on page 97. And it says something I think is really important, which is that organizations need to create concrete indicators for each stakeholder group. Basically, our metrics. How will we know what the different stakeholder groups want? And then how do we measure whether we're helping to fulfill what it is they want? So, obvious examples, we can do customer satisfaction surveys. We can do organizational climate surveys to assess the welfare of our employees. Certainly there are any number of things that we can look at that shareholders, investors consider important. Return on investment is one of those. Return on assets is another. Earnings per share is another. There are, in fact, a number of metrics that we can use for these kinds of stakeholders. Coming up with metrics that we might use for other types of stakeholders can, in fact, be more challenging. But that doesn't mean less important. It means that it simply hasn't come into the norm yet for how we do business. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about what those metrics might look like. It all starts by asking, what is each stakeholder's stake in the company? What is our relationship? So, what is the relationship that we have and want to have with our employees? What is the relationship that we have and want to have with our investors? What is the relationship that we have and want to have with the relevant government agencies? What is the relationship that we want to have with the communities in which our organization resides? So, what is that relationship? And then further, how do we go ahead and create shared value? This, of course, is a tremendous challenge. We might know how to make a given product or deliver a particular service, but how do we maximize the value associated with whatever it is we're delivering? The truth is, stakeholder management is an incredibly complex field of endeavor. It isn't something that is easy to do. Simply tracking and trying to manage relationships with one stakeholder group can be very difficult. Doing it with all relevant stakeholders, very complex. That said, it still needs to be done if the organization is in fact going to be responsible, as is discussed in this particular chapter. Now, of course, we need to benefit both our internal and our external stakeholders. So we can't neglect one for the other. If we do that, we are not demonstrating full corporate social responsibility. So how do we do this? Well, one is trying to think about what will optimize, and I'm a little uncertain about that particular word because I'm not sure that optimization is in fact necessarily ideal or maybe even practically possible. I think we want to do the best possible given the resources we have, given the resources that we can access, but to optimize, when you optimize one area, it often requires sub-optimizing in other areas. And so we want to be very careful about how we use that word. But we talk about trying to optimize stakeholder value in the long run. And again, a sticking point that I raised in the last chapter is, what does that actually mean? When you say long run, are we talking about next year, 2 years, 5 years, a generation, multiple generations? What is the long run? To ask people to think about something that we can't quantify in any way and then expect them to perform and be assessed, that's a pretty impractical expectation. And it smacks of philosophizing rather than managing, rather than leading. So we're going to need to define for our organization, what do we mean by the long run? We also need to consider the extended enterprise, that entire net of stakeholders and all of the relationships that need to be managed within that net. All of those folks that we influence and that influence us. And then finally, we need to understand how everybody's connected. The notion that stakeholders are islands unto themselves is not a practical way to think about the interconnected and synergistic net that comprises the organization's environment. One of the things that your authors talk about is this notion of trying to maximize one stakeholder group's value. This is what I was saying in terms of optimizing. We need to be very careful how we think about optimizing, whether it's, we say we're going to be totally focused on our employees. Okay, well, in trying to totally focus on our employees, a real simplistic example is we pay them a wage that then is something that the customers can't afford to pay for whatever it is we're offering in terms of product or service. Or we want to offer our customers the cheapest possible product or service, and in doing that, we end up paying our employees substandard wages or non-living wages. That sort of optimizing one group at the expense of others is not something that we would consider responsible. Instead, the authors make, I think, a pretty good argument for fairness in distribution, and they say at minimum between our internal and external stakeholders. All right, point 3 focuses entirely on 4.4b, stakeholder assessment, on page 97, and basically just a very quick outline of what this looks like to make sure we're understanding. We've got stakeholder management, which comprises 2 pieces. The first is assessment. The second is involvement. Okay, so assessment, involvement. Okay, together those lead to stakeholder value. Stakeholder assessment, we start first by identifying who are our stakeholders. Take a look at figure 4.9 on page 100. It does a beautiful job of illustrating how we might map who our stakeholders are and how they're related to us. We look at things like dependency, responsibility, tension, influence, trying to figure out, okay, who are we, who are our stakeholders, and then how do we group them? Are they internal? Are they primary? Are they secondary? Are they in fact non-stakeholders? So this requires conversation, dialogue within the organization to make sure that we are being exhaustive in identifying who all of these stakeholders are. Okay, so that's the first piece, identification. The second part of assessment is prioritization. How do we decide who gets our attention first? Who gets the majority of our resources? Who do we focus? We cannot focus on everyone exactly the same, all at the same time, using exactly the same resources, etc., 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 right? So even though you might, for example, love all of your children, you can't give them the same thing at the same time all of the time. You might find yourself behaving sequentially, for example. Okay, so we have to figure out who, for our organization, who are our highest priority stakeholders. How do we figure that out? Well, it might depend on the time, the situation. It could depend on, if you look in figure 410, things like who's got the power, whose needs are most urgent, who has the most legitimate claims to our resources. Another way of thinking about it is who offers us the greatest potential for cooperation, and then one that I think really matters, who offers the greatest potential for threat. And the way I always phrase this is who can hurt us and how badly can they hurt us. Now that's not a very positive take, I acknowledge that, but I think it's an important take. We need to keep in mind who can help us, who can hurt us, and then behave accordingly in terms of prioritizing. The last piece talks about stakeholder involvement. Okay, remember this is the second piece of stakeholder management, involvement. So there we're talking 2 pieces. Again, everything's in 2s. Communication, so we have to choose how do we communicate with these different stakeholder groups. What is it that they need to hear from us? When do they need to hear it? How do they need to hear it? How important is what they need to hear, etc. And then ultimately reach a point where we are jointly creating, where we are working collaboratively together with these key stakeholder groups to achieve synergistic outcomes. Those 3 points are really the bottom line of this particular chapter. Thanks.